In 1920, the United States had 253,000 miles of railroad track, the largest rail network any country had ever built. Today, there are 140,000 miles. America tore up, abandoned, or paved over 100,000 miles of its own railroad. That's enough track to circle the Earth 4 times. Gone. Not destroyed by war, not wiped out by disaster, removed on purpose, mile by mile, while almost nobody asked why. This is the story of the most connected nation on Earth and how it chose to disconnect itself. To understand what we lost, you have to understand what we had. And what we had in 1920 was nothing short of miraculous. Picture the map. Every county in America connected. Every town with more than a few hundred people reachable by rail. You could board a train in rural Kansas and step off in Manhattan. You could ship a crate of apples from Oregon to a grocer in Philadelphia. A farmer in Nebraska could put his daughter on a train to visit her grandmother in Chicago, and she would arrive the same day. 253,000 miles. That number doesn't mean much until you compare it to something. The entire circumference of the Earth is about 25,000 miles. America had enough railroad track to wrap around the planet 10 times over. 10 times. Built by hand. Laid through deserts and over mountains and across rivers that men died trying to bridge. And every mile of it worked. Trains ran on schedules printed in booklets so thick they had to be bound like novels. The official guide of the railways, they called it. And in 1920, it listed over 20,000 passenger trains running daily across the United States. 20,000 every single day. You could live in a town of 800 people in West Virginia and catch a train to work in the next valley over. You could ship livestock from Texas to Chicago in refrigerated cars that kept the meat cold the whole way. You could send a letter from San Francisco to New York and know it would arrive in 3 days, carried on trains that ran through the night while you slept. This was the circulatory system of American commerce, the arteries that fed every organ of the economy. Steel and coal and lumber and grain flowed through these lines like blood through veins. And the men who built it, the men who operated it, they knew they were building something permanent, something their grandchildren would inherit. And they were wrong. But in 1920, nobody could have imagined what was coming. The railroad had won. Every competitor had failed. Canals were obsolete. Stagecoaches were museum pieces. The automobile existed, sure, but it was a toy for the wealthy, a novelty that broke down on unpaved roads. The airplane was a curiosity, a barnstormer's trick, barely capable of carrying mail, let alone passengers. The railroad was king. And kings, as history teaches us, rarely see the revolution coming. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone employed over 250,000 workers in 1920. That's more people than served in the entire United States Army during peacetime. The New York Central, the Southern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Santa Fe. These weren't companies, they were empires. They owned hotels and steamship lines and telegraph networks, and they controlled the flow of everything that moved in America. Railroad executives sat on the boards of banks and steel mills and coal mines. Railroad stocks were the foundation of investment portfolios. When J.P. Morgan reorganized American finance, he did it through the railroads. When the federal government wanted to move troops or supplies, it called the railroads. When a president wanted to campaign across the country, he did it from the back of a railroad car. This was power, real power, the kind that shapes nations and moves mountains and bends rivers to its will. And the men who built this power, the laborers and section hands and brakemen, they paid for it in blood. Railroad work in 1920 was still among the most dangerous jobs in America. Coupling cars by hand crushed fingers and arms. Brake wheels spinning out of control broke wrists and threw men from moving trains. Switch yards at night were labyrinths of moving steel where one wrong step meant death. The railroad gave America its spine, and the men who laid that spine, who maintained it, who operated it through blizzards and floods and the dark of winter nights, they believed they were building something eternal. They had no idea that in 50 years, half of it would be gone. The decline didn't start with a single moment. It crept in slowly, the way rust creeps into iron, and the first sign of rust came from an unlikely place, not from a competitor, from the government that had helped build the railroads in the first place. In 1920, the same year the railroad network reached its peak, Congress passed the Transportation Act. On paper, it looked like a gift. It returned the railroads to private ownership after the government had operated them during World War I. But buried in that act was something else, something that would slowly strangle the industry over the next 50 years, the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC had existed since 1887, originally created to prevent railroad monopolies from gouging farmers and shippers. But the Transportation Act of 1920 gave it new powers, sweeping powers. The ICC would now approve every rate the railroads charged, every route they operated, every branch line they wanted to close. Every decision that mattered would now require government permission. The railroads had built themselves without asking anyone's permission. They had laid track wherever they saw opportunity, charged whatever the market would bear, abandoned lines that didn't pay. That freedom had made them powerful. That freedom was now gone. And at first, it didn't seem to matter. The 20s roared, and the railroads roared with them. Freight tonnage climbed. Passenger counts held steady. The big trunk lines still made money. The government regulators collected their fees and held their hearings and issued their rulings. But the trains kept running. Then came 1929, the crash, the depression, and everything changed. Freight traffic collapsed, factories closed, and the products they made stopped moving. Mines shut down, and the coal and ore that had filled freight cars vanished. Farmers couldn't afford to ship their crops, and the crops rotted in the fields. Passenger traffic dropped as people stopped traveling, stopped visiting relatives, stopped taking vacations they could no longer afford. The railroads bled money. And when they tried to stop the bleeding, when they tried to close branch lines that served dying towns and eliminate routes that no longer made sense, the ICC said no. Those routes served the public interest. Those branch lines connected communities. The railroads had an obligation to lose money, an obligation to maintain track that no longer paid, an obligation to run trains through towns where nobody got on and nobody got off. This was the first wound. The government that had once subsidized railroad construction was now mandating railroad suicide. But the railroads might have survived even this. They were resilient. They had survived panics and strikes and wars. What they could not survive was competition, and competition was coming. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T. It cost $850, more than most Americans earned in a year. By 1925, the price had dropped to $260. Suddenly, the automobile was not a rich man's toy. It was a family necessity. The numbers tell the story. In 1910, there were fewer than 500,000 automobiles registered in the United States. By 1920, that number had grown to over 9 million. By 1930, 26 million. Americans were buying cars faster than anyone had ever bought anything in history, and they needed roads to drive them on. At first, the roads were terrible, unpaved, muddy in spring, dusty in summer, impassable in winter. A trip that took 4 hours by train might take 2 days by car, if you could make it at all. The railroads looked at the automobile and laughed. Let the farmers play with their toys. The real business of transportation belonged to steel rails. They were still laughing when the states started paving roads, when the federal government started matching funds, when the Lincoln Highway opened as the first transcontinental automobile route, when truck companies started hauling freight that used to fill boxcars. The automobile was eating the railroad alive, and the railroads, strangled by ICC regulations, couldn't fight back. Here's what the automobile offered that the railroad couldn't match: freedom. You didn't have to wait for a train schedule. You didn't have to take your goods to a depot and wait for them to be loaded onto a freight car and then wait for them to be unloaded at the other end. You drove when you wanted. You stopped where you wanted. You went directly from your door to your destination's door. For short hauls, the truck was faster. For passengers, the car was more convenient. And as roads improved, the disadvantages shrank while the advantages grew. The railroads responded the only way they could under ICC control. They asked permission. Permission to lower rates. Permission to close unprofitable stations. permission to reduce service on routes that no longer made sense. And the ICC, moving at the speed of bureaucracy, taking testimony and holding hearings and issuing rulings that took months or years, usually said no. Meanwhile, the trucks and cars kept coming, and the railroads kept bleeding. Then came the war, World War II, and for a brief shining moment, the railroads were essential again. America needed to move troops, millions of them, needed to move tanks and planes and ammunition and supplies, needed to move all of it fast, across a continent, to ports where ships waited to carry it overseas. And the only way to do that, the only way to move that much material that quickly, was by rail. The railroads rose to the challenge. They moved more freight than they had ever moved before. 90% of all military freight, 97% of all military personnel. The entire war effort rode on steel rails. The railroads ran trains around the clock, deferred maintenance, pushed equipment to its limits. They did what the nation asked, and when the war ended, they expected gratitude. They expected recognition. They expected, perhaps, some relief from the regulations that had been choking them for 20 years. What they got instead was the interstate highway system. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, 41,000 miles of limited access highways, the largest public works project in American history up to that point, and the government would pay for 90% of it. 90%. The railroads had built their own tracks with private money. They maintained their own rights of way. They paid property taxes on every mile of rail they owned. And now the government was building a competing transportation network, paying for almost all of it with tax dollars, and handing it over to trucks and cars to use for free. The interstate highway system was a knife to the throat of the American railroad, and nobody even tried to stop the bleeding. Think about what those highways meant. A truck could now drive from Los Angeles to New York on smooth, limited access pavement. No stoplights. No mud, no waiting for ferries or finding bridges. The same trip that had once taken weeks now took days, and the trucker could pick up freight at a factory door and deliver it to a warehouse door without ever touching a railroad. For passengers, the story was the same. A family of 4 could drive their own car on their own schedule, at their own pace. They could stop for meals where they wanted, stay at motels along the way, see the country through their own windshield instead of a train window. And the highways were free. The gas was cheap. The car was already paid for. Why would anyone take a train? The railroads knew the answer. They knew people would take trains if train travel was fast enough, convenient enough, cheap enough. They knew they could compete if they were allowed to compete, if they could set their own rates, if they could close their own routes, if they could run their own business without asking permission for every decision. But the ICC still controlled everything, and the ICC still said no. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the railroads filed thousands of applications to abandon unprofitable branch lines, lines that served towns that had shrunk, lines that carried a few carloads of freight a week, lines that cost more to maintain than they could ever earn. The ICC held hearings, took testimony, listened to community groups who feared losing their rail connection, considered the public interest, and more often than not, the ICC denied the applications. Keep the lines open, run the trains, lose the money. Meanwhile, the passenger trains bled worst of all. In 1946, American railroads carried over 770 million passengers. By 1957, that number had dropped to 412 million. By 1965, under 300 million. By 1970, barely 200 million. The railroads tried everything: domed observation cars, reclining seats, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver service. It didn't matter. The interstate called. The airlines called even louder. Because while the highways were killing short and medium-distance rail travel, the airlines were killing long distance. A flight from New York to Los Angeles took 6 hours. The train took 3 days. For business travelers, there was no contest. For vacationers, the romance of rail travel faded fast against the novelty of flight. By the late 1960s, most railroad passenger trains were running at massive losses. Like the Southern Pacific was losing $15 million a year on passenger service alone. The Penn Central, the largest railroad in America, was losing money on almost everything. The industry that had built America was dying. And then came the collapse. May 1970. The Penn Central Railroad filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time. A railroad that had been worth billions of dollars, that employed over 100,000 people, that operated over 20,000 miles of track, was broke, finished, unable to pay its bills. The Penn Central bankruptcy was an earthquake. It shook Wall Street. It shook Washington. It forced everyone to admit what had been obvious for years. The American railroad industry was in crisis, and if something didn't change, there would be no railroads left to save. Something changed, but for many lines, it was already too late. In 1970, Congress created Amtrak to take over passenger rail. The private railroads gratefully handed over their money-losing passenger trains and walked away. Amtrak would be subsidized. Amtrak would absorb the losses. Amtrak would maintain at least the illusion that America still had passenger rail. The illusion came at a cost. Amtrak took over about 20,000 miles of passenger routes. That sounds like a lot until you remember that in 1920, the railroads had operated over 250,000 miles. Amtrak was a skeleton, a handful of routes connecting major cities while the rest of America lost rail service forever. Then, in 1976, Congress created Conrail to take over the bankrupt freight railroads of the Northeast. Penn Central, Erie, Lackawanna, Reading, Lehigh Valley, Jersey Central, names that had meant something once, names that had built the industrial heartland. Now they were wards of the state, merged into a government-sponsored corporation that would try to salvage what could be salvaged. And what couldn't be salvaged, it was abandoned. Torn up, sold for scrap, this is where the real loss happened. Not in the boardrooms or the bankruptcy courts, but on the ground, on the branch lines that connected small towns, on the secondary routes that had once carried local freight, on the thousands of miles of track that no longer made economic sense under any analysis. The abandonment era, from roughly 1950 through the early 1980s, this is when America truly tore itself apart. Let me give you specific examples because the numbers mean nothing without stories. The Milwaukee Road, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, to use its full name. In its heyday, it operated over 10,000 miles of track from Chicago to the Pacific coast. The route through Montana and Washington was one of the most scenic in America, climbing through mountain passes that had taken years to survey and billions of dollars in today's money to build. In 1980, the Milwaukee Road abandoned its Pacific extension, everything west of Miles City, Montana. Nearly 1,000 miles of mainline track just gone. The tunnels still stand in places, concrete monuments to ambition and failure. The grades are still visible if you know where to look. On climbing into mountains where no trains will ever run again, or take the Rock Island Line, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. It had operated since 1852, served 14 states, employed tens of thousands of workers. In 1980, it ceased operations entirely. The entire railroad liquidated. Every employee laid off. Every mile of track either sold to other railroads or abandoned. In towns across Kansas and Oklahoma and Iowa, the Rock Island tracks were pulled up and sold as scrap. The depots, where families had once waited for trains that connected them to the wider world, were torn down or left to rot. The grades were converted to roads or simply plowed under and returned to farmland. The New York, Ontario, and Western Railway, abandoned completely in 1957, the first major railroad in the Northeast to simply give up. 150 miles of track through the Catskills and Sullivan County, serving communities that had depended on rail for decades. Gone. The right-of-way is a hiking trail now in some places. In others, it's impossible to tell there was ever a railroad there at all. The Rutland Railway in Vermont, abandoned in 1963. The Maine Central's Mountain Division through Crawford Notch, abandoned in 1983. The Denver and Rio Grande Western's narrow-gauge routes through Colorado, abandoned piece by piece through the 1950s and 1960s, except for a few tourist operations. Each abandonment followed a similar pattern. The railroad would file an application with the ICC. The ICC would hold hearings. Local communities would protest, fearing the loss of their connection to the outside world. The railroad would present financial data showing years of losses, decades sometimes, on the route in question. Eventually, permission would be granted, and then the crews would come. Imagine it. You're a section hand on a branch line that's been abandoned. Yesterday, you maintained this track, kept the ties in good repair, made sure the rails were properly aligned. Today, your job is to destroy what you built. The rails come up first, cut into sections, loaded onto flat cars, hauled to a scrapyard where they'll be melted down and turned into something else. The ties come up next, thrown aside or burned in piles that smolder for days. The spikes, the fish plates, the hardware that held everything together, all of it salvaged and sold. What's left is a scar across the landscape. A ribbon of disturbed earth that slowly grows over with weeds and trees. In 10 years, you might not know there was ever a railroad there. In 20 years, only old-timers remember. In 50 years, even the old-timers are gone. By 1980, America had abandoned over 60,000 miles of railroad since the 1920 peak. By 2000, the total would rise to over 80,000 miles. Today, the number stands somewhere around 100,000 miles. 100,000 miles of railroad that America built with blood and dynamite and the labor of millions, torn up and thrown away. And the communities that had depended on those railroads, they shrank. They died. They turned into places people left instead of places people came to. If you're over 60 years old, you remember more rail service than exists today. You remember being able to catch a train in towns that no longer have stations. You remember routes that connected places that now require driving. You remember when the railroad was still part of American life, not just a freight hauler and a nostalgic curiosity. That memory is important because it proves that what we have today is not inevitable. It's a choice, and other countries made different choices. Let me tell you about Japan. In 1964, Japan opened the Tokaido Shinkansen, the bullet train, 130 miles per hour, from Tokyo to Osaka in 4 hours, a route that had taken over 6 hours by conventional rail. It was the fastest train in the world. It was a technological marvel, and it was a statement. Japan had been devastated by war. Its cities had been bombed, its industry destroyed, its economy shattered. But Japan chose to invest in rail, to build new, to build better, to build something that would carry the nation into the future. The Shinkansen changed everything. It proved that trains could compete with airplanes on routes up to 500 miles. It proved that high-speed rail was not a fantasy, but a practical technology. It proved that a nation that invested in rail infrastructure could reap enormous economic benefits. Today, the Shinkansen network carries over 400 million passengers a year. It has never had a fatal accident. Never? Not one passenger killed in an accident in over 60 years of operation. The trains run on time to within seconds. The technology has been copied around the world. And the United States? In 1964, while Japan was opening the Shinkansen, when America was still debating whether to subsidize passenger rail at all. America was still allowing its railroad network to decay. America was still pouring money into highways and airports while its trains rusted on the tracks. France made a similar choice. In 1981, France opened the TG5, the train à grande vitesse, 200 miles per hour, Paris to Lyon in 2 hours. Today, the TGV network connects every major city in France, and French trains run into Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, and Britain through the Channel Tunnel. Spain built high-speed rail. Germany built high-speed rail. China built the largest high-speed rail network in the world, over 25,000 miles, all since 2008. These countries looked at the same transportation challenges America faced, and they made different choices. America chose the highway. America chose the airport. America chose to tear up the railroad it had spent a century building. Was it the wrong choice? That's not a simple question. The highways did deliver real benefits. The automobile did provide freedom that the railroad could never match. The airlines did make long-distance travel faster and more accessible. America's choices were not irrational. They were responses to real economic and social forces. But choices have consequences. And the consequence of abandoning the railroad is visible every day. Look at the freight side. America still has the best freight rail network in the world. The remaining 140,000 miles of track move more ton-miles of freight than any other country's railroad. This is not nothing. This is genuinely impressive. American freight rail is profitable, efficient, and essential to the economy. But look at the passenger side. Amtrak serves about 500 stations in 46 states. That sounds like a lot until you realize that's fewer stations than the Pennsylvania Railroad alone served in 1920. Most Americans cannot reach an Amtrak station without driving for hours. Most Americans have no practical access to passenger rail at all. And look at what we lost. Not just the physical infrastructure, but the communities it supported. Towns that grew up around railroad junctions. Economies that depended on rail access. Patterns of life that assumed you could always catch a train. Think about the small town that used to have a depot. The depot was the center of community life. It was where you met visitors, where you sent telegrams, where you picked up packages from the Railway Express, where young people left for the city, and where soldiers came home from war. The depot was a connection to the wider world, a portal that linked your little town to every other town on the line. When the railroad left, the depot closed. Sometimes the building stood empty for years before it was torn down. Sometimes it was converted to another use, a museum or an antique shop or a restaurant. But the function it had served, the connection it had provided, that was gone forever. And the people in that town had to make a choice. Get a car or get left behind. Many of them got cars. Many of them moved. And the towns that had thrived when the railroad came through, those towns slowly emptied out. You can see them today, driving through rural America. The brick buildings on Main Street with faded signs, the empty lots where businesses used to stand, the cemeteries full of names from another era. These towns didn't die because the railroad left. They died because of 100 factors, economic and social and demographic. But the railroad leaving was part of it, sometimes a big part. When the railroad left, the town lost its link to the national economy, lost its ability to ship goods cheaply, lost its connection to markets and jobs and opportunities. The railroad had brought these towns into being, and the railroad's departure accelerated their decline. There's something else we lost, something harder to measure but no less real. We lost the skill of the railroad men, the section hands who could align a rail by eye, the engineers who could feel a locomotive's health through the vibration of the throttle, the dispatchers who kept 100 trains moving safely on a single track line, doing it all with telegraph keys and timetables and the accumulated wisdom of generations. These skills were passed down, father to son, mentor to apprentice. You didn't learn to be a railroad man in a classroom. You learned it on the job, making mistakes and learning from them, absorbing knowledge that had been refined over a century of practice. When the railroads contracted, those jobs disappeared. And when the jobs disappeared, the skills disappeared with them. The men who knew how to run a railroad retired or died or moved on to other work. The knowledge they carried, the institutional memory of how to operate the most complex transportation system ever built, and that knowledge was lost. We kept some of it. The freight railroads that survived, the ones that exist today, they still employ skilled people. But they employ far fewer of them. And the branches of the craft that vanished with the branch lines, those can never be recovered. There's an argument that none of this matters, that we live in a different world now, that the automobile and the airplane serve our needs better than the railroad ever could, that the market spoke and the market chose and the railroad lost fair and square. There's some truth in this argument, but only some, because the market didn't operate freely. The government subsidized highways. The government subsidized airports. The government regulated railroads to the point of strangulation while building competing transportation networks with tax dollars. The playing field was tilted, and it was tilted against the railroad. If the railroads had been allowed to compete on equal terms, If they had been allowed to set their own rates and close their own routes and invest in their own infrastructure without asking permission, would the outcome have been different? We'll never know. The experiment was never run. What we do know is this. Other countries that subsidized rail instead of suppressing it, have rail networks that work, trains that run fast and on time, stations that serve as centers of civic life, transportation options that don't require owning a car. And we know this. The 100,000 miles of railroad we tore up are not coming back. Those rights of way are gone, developed, paved, returned to nature. Yes, the cost of rebuilding even a fraction of what we had would be astronomical. Tens of billions, hundreds of billions, more than any plausible political coalition would ever support. So we live with what we have. A freight network that works, a passenger network that barely exists, and the ghost of what used to be. Some of those ghosts have found new life. The rail trail movement has converted thousands of miles of abandoned railroad into walking and biking paths. The Katy Trail in Missouri, 240 miles along the old Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad. The Great Allegheny Passage in Pennsylvania, 150 miles from Pittsburgh to Cumberland. Dozens of others across the country. Rails to trails conversions that preserve the right-of-way, even if they can't preserve the railroad. These trails are valuable. They're beautiful. They connect communities and provide recreation and preserve history in a way that nothing else could. But let's be honest about what they are. They're tombs. They're monuments to what used to be. You walk where trains used to run, and you see the old bridges and the old tunnel portals and the old mile markers, and you understand that something is missing. Something that carried passengers and freight and mail and dreams. Something that connected this place to everywhere else. Now it's a walking path. And that's fine. That's good even. But it's not the same. The railroad men who built these lines, who maintained them, who ran trains on them for decades, they would be amazed to see what happened. They built for permanence. They carved through mountains and bridged rivers and laid track that was supposed to last forever. They believed they were building the future. They were wrong. Or rather, the future turned out to be different than anyone expected. The automobile and the airplane and the interstate came, and the railroad retreated, and the future that those railroad men imagined, the future of trains and stations and schedules and connections, that future died. What do we owe them? The men who built what we destroyed? The generations who gave their labor and their health, and sometimes their lives to create the most extensive rail network in history? At minimum, we owe them memory. We owe them the acknowledgement that what they built mattered, that it was real and important and changed the world, that the railroad made modern America possible, knit together a continent, created an economy that dominated the 20th century. We owe them the truth. The truth that we tore up their work not because it failed, but because we chose not to maintain it, because we preferred highways, because we let regulators strangle what should have thrived, because we made choices, generation after generation, and the cumulative effect of those choices was the destruction of something magnificent. And we owe them, perhaps, a reckoning, a moment of honest assessment about what we lost and why, about whether the choices we made were wise, about whether there might have been another path, one where the railroad survived and evolved and remained part of American life. That reckoning is uncomfortable. Nobody likes to admit mistakes. Nobody likes to say, we spent a century building something extraordinary, and then we threw half of it away. But the truth remains the truth, whether we acknowledge it or not. 253,000 miles. That's what America had in 1920. The most extensive railroad network any nation has ever built. Every town connected, every shipment possible, every journey achievable. 140,000 miles. That's what we have now. Less than we had. Less than we need. Less than we could have if we had chosen differently. The difference, those 100,000 miles, they haunt the American landscape like ghost limbs. The grades that go nowhere. The bridge abutments that stand alone in rivers. The tunnels that open into darkness and never emerge. The towns that shrank when the trains stopped running. The skills that died when the jobs disappeared. We did this to ourselves, not through neglect, through choice, through a million small decisions that added up to abandonment, through regulations that made railroads unprofitable, through subsidies that made highways irresistible, through a culture that fell in love with the automobile and forgot what the railroad had given us. And now the tracks are gone. The depots are closed. The schedules are memories held only by the old. The railroad that built America has retreated to its core, still vital for freight, almost invisible for passengers. The story isn't over. It never is. High-speed rail projects struggle forward in California and Texas. Brightline runs trains in Florida. Amtrak proposes expansions that may or may not be funded. There are people who believe in rail, who fight for rail, who dream of restoring some fraction of what was lost. Maybe they'll succeed. Maybe the future will include trains again, real trains, fast trains, on trains that serve as viable alternatives to driving and flying. Maybe the next generation will look at what we threw away and decide to rebuild some of it, but they'll never rebuild all of it. The 100,000 miles are gone. The communities are gone. The world that made those railroads necessary and those railroads profitable, that world is gone too. You can't resurrect the past. You can only learn from it. What we learn depends on what we're willing to see. If we see only the inevitability of technological change, we learn nothing. If we see the choices that were made, the subsidies, and the regulations and the priorities that shape the outcome, we might learn something about how choices compound over time, how decisions made for good reasons can have consequences that last for generations. How a nation that builds something magnificent has an obligation maybe to maintain it. 253,000 miles, the most connected country on Earth, and we tore it up. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to know what we're capable of, enough to understand what we lost. The tracks stretch to the horizon, but they're empty now. The schedules that once filled thick booklets are down to a handful of daily trains. The depots that were once the centers of community life are museums, if they're anything at all. This is what we chose. This is what we built, and what we abandoned, and what we'll never get back. The railroad made America, and America, in its wisdom or its folly, decided it didn't need the railroad anymore. If you're still watching, you're not here by accident. You understand that the past matters, that the choices nations make have consequences that echo for generations, that the story of American decline isn't just about politics or economics, it's about infrastructure, about the physical backbone of a civilization, and what happens when that backbone is allowed to decay. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about what we built, what we lost, and what we owe to the people who came before us. Stories that don't look away from hard truths. The railroad men deserve better than they got. They built something permanent, and we made it temporary. They gave their lives to something larger than themselves, and we decided we didn't need it anymore. 100,000 miles. Circle the earth 4 times. Gone. That's not a statistic. That's a tragedy. And it deserves to be remembered. The next time you're stuck in traffic on a highway that was built over an old railroad grade, think about it. Think about what used to be there. Think about the men who laid those tracks, who believed they were building something that would outlast them. Think about the choices that led from there to here. And ask yourself whether we might have chosen differently. Whether we still can. The railroad built this country. What we did with that gift is a question every generation has to answer for itself.